All right, it's about time for us to start. It's good to be here with you tonight. It's good to have all of you here as well. Got a number of visitors with us tonight. That's always enjoyable. Before we get started, though, we're going to go to God in a word of prayer, and Stuart's going to lead us in that prayer.
Dear God, heaven, thank you so much for this opportunity that we have to come together to study the book of the Word. Thank you for the church that Jesus instituted, death, burial, and resurrection. Thank you that we come together to encourage one another, and build each other up. Pray that as we go through the study tonight, to learn something, make application to our lives where it's applicable. Help us always to honor you. These things we ask in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. All right. We've been studying the book of Exodus on Wednesday nights, and tonight we're going to be looking at chapters 21 through 24 of the book of Exodus. And what these chapters are a basic expansion of the Ten Commandments, if you will, right? They're referred to in chapter 24 as the Book of the Covenant, and there is some debate as to whether or not that Book of the Covenant is just what we read in these chapters, or if there's more to it. We just simply don't know. But your chart basically lists all the Ten Commandments, and the idea is as you read through these chapters, especially 21, 22, and 23, right, that you saw things or picked out things that would fall under one of these Ten Commandments as kind of like an expansion of it. You got to understand that the Ten Commandments are basically just a very brief, concise statement that cover a lot of aspects of Israel's behavior. The Ten Commandments alone are not the first covenant. They are just an encapsulation, if you will, of the covenant that God makes with Israel. So it seems to me that the most logical way to go about this would simply go through each of the commandments and then see where different issues that would relate to that particular commandment. So if we look at the first commandment in chapter 20, verses 3 through 6, where God says, "You shall have no gods before me, and you shall make no graven image." Okay. Now, as we read through chapters 21 through 23, what passages, what verses stood out to you as being associated with this initial command? Anybody got any? I'll give you an idea of what we're talking about. Let's take a look at chapter 22 at verse 18. In chapter 22 at verse 18, God says, "You shall not permit a sorceress to live." Okay? We're going to find various commands in the Old Testament that talk about the occult, witchcraft, sorcery, if you will. But how might that relate to the first command, having no gods before me? Okay, all right. The idea of attributing the power, right, that they might witness or see to something other than God. Okay, very good. The idea of witchcraft or sorcery, the occult, is basically acknowledging power or knowledge in other areas besides God, right? And spiritual beings or what have you. And that, in a sense, is having another God before God. You know, the idea of the stars, reading your horoscope, right? A lot of people read their horoscopes, just get a kick out of it. But there's a whole lot of people that take astrology very seriously, okay? Believe it or not, there's people that take Chinese fortune cookies very seriously. I only do when they say good things, right? But, you know, the idea is when you start dabbling in the occult and mysticism and things of that nature, you are ascribing to it a power that only belongs to God, okay? And you're putting your trust and your faith in something other than God, right? And so what did God say was to happen to those who practiced the occult arts, if you will? So they're be put to death, right? Okay. You shall not suffer or permit a sorceress to live. All right. 22 at verse 20, right? Very good, Ken. In 22 at verse 20, it says, he who sacrifices to any god except to the Lord only shall be utterly destroyed, right? And that would certainly follow under one of the first commandments, right? You shall have no other gods before me. Anybody find anything else or see anything else in these chapters that you might relate to that? Yeah, 23:13. If we look at chapter 23 at verse 13, God says, and in all that I have said to you, be circumspect and make no mention of the name of other gods, nor let it be heard from your mouth. So God's attitude towards these other so-called gods, the gods that the Canaanites worship, are not even to be spoken, not even to be mentioned by the Israelites. You've got the Balaam, you've got Molech, you've got these different gods, Asherah. God says, I don't even want you talking about them. Okay. And so it says, you shall not even speak of them. All right. I found at least one more. Anybody else find anything else? Yeah. Okay. If you look at 23 verses 20 through 33, actually, right, you've got the idea of the blessings of following God. This whole paragraph, this whole section, 20 through 33, God says in verse 20, behold, I will send an angel before you to keep you in the way and bring you into the place which I have prepared. Beware of him and obey his voice. Do not provoke him, for he will not pardon your transgressions, for my name is in him. But if you indeed obey his voice and do all that I speak, then I will be an enemy to your enemies and an adversary to your adversaries. For my angel will go before you and bring you into the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Canaanites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites, and I will cut them off. You shall not bow down to their gods, nor serve them, nor do according to their works, but you shall utterly overthrow them and completely break down their sacred pillars. So you shall serve the Lord your God, and he will bless your bread and your water. And I will take sickness away from the midst of you. No one shall suffer miscarriage or be barren in your land. I will fulfill the number of your days. Think about verses 25 through 26. What is God promising his people here if they follow him wholly? Every blessing, right? But he's talking about health. I'll give you health. I'll bless your food and I'll bless your water. Okay? And that could mean I will give you an abundance of both, or I will keep it healthy and pure for you as well. He talks about nobody will miscarry, right? He says in verse 26, no one shall suffer miscarriage or be barren in your land, right? Now, the thing is we know throughout Israel's history, did everything pan out this way? No, not at all. Not at all. Think about the blessings that God's offering here if they would just be careful to follow him. Of course, they don't, and so none of those things come about. Right? Ken?
Verse 22 is very conditional. Verse 22 says,
Yeah, it's conditional. It says, but if you indeed obey his voice, right? So it's very conditional. In verse 27, he says, I will send my fear before you. I will cause confusion among all the people to whom you come, and will make all your enemies turn their backs to you. And I will send hornets before you, which shall drive out the Hivite, the Canaanite, the Hittite from before you. Now think about that. When they went up to Kadesh Barnea, right, and they were supposed to go in and conquer the land, what was their reaction? No, we're not going to do it. But look what God says. He says, if you will wholly follow me and obey me, I'll drive everybody out before you. It's like they had nothing to fear except for the fact they didn't keep the commands of the Lord, right? And Joshua and Caleb, it seems, were the only ones that actually took God at his word. He says, verse 29, I will not drive them out from before you in 1 year, lest the land become desolate and the beasts of the field become too numerous for you. Little by little, I will drive them out from before you until you have increased and you inherit the land. And I will set your bounds from the Red Sea to the Sea of the Philistines, from the desert to the river. For I will deliver the inhabitants of the land into your hand, and you shall drive them out before you. You shall make no covenant with them, nor with their gods. They shall not dwell in your land, lest they make you sin against me. For if you serve their gods, it will surely be a snare to you. So this whole passage really falls under the idea of you shall have no gods before me. But I want you to notice verse 33. What lessons can we learn from that? What lessons can we learn from that? What application can we make from verse 33?
Influence of other people.
Influence of other people, right? The influence of other people. Now, clearly, we're not Israelites, okay? And God, tells us that he doesn't expect us to go out of the world, right? But be very different from the world. And he tells us not to suffer worldliness within the congregation. Paul says a little leaven leavens the whole lump, right? So the idea here is there's a great potential for influence from people outside the church, from the world in which we must live and we must work. And we have to be constantly on guard for that and careful about that. The influence that the world exerts on Christians, is it always noticeable? It happens gradually. It happens over time. It oftentimes happens imperceptibly, right? How long do you think it will be before we have an upcoming generation within the church that starts to question why we should think there's anything wrong with the homosexual lifestyle? I mean, we sit here and we think, oh, that would never happen, right? It's all what? Oh, yeah, it's already happening in the denominations. The Lutheran Church right down here on the corner of Rolling Hills in Missouri, old Missouri, they've got a big rainbow poster outside saying Pride Month and what have you, right? It's happening in the denominations. And we as Christians are constantly being bombarded with that message, okay? Now, for those of us who have been Christians for a while, those of us who are older, we may be so set in our ways that we think, no, that's wrong. That's just wrong. But when you're dealing with 5-year-olds going to public schools, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, as they're growing up, they're constantly hearing that message, right? They're constantly being exposed to curricular literature or curriculum literature. I have 2 mommies, right? Or I have 2 dads, and what have you. And this is a very common thing. And so as parents, as grandparents, we have to be very diligent to make sure and to teach our children and our grandchildren what is acceptable behavior and what is not, right? Based on not this is the way I was raised, but based on God's word, right?
That's exactly right. Difficulty comes from most people is they don't understand. It's not just you tell them it's not. You teach them it's not. That's a big difference.
Yeah, you have to teach them that's not right, based on God's word. And see, we have a very difficult time because you have got the world espousing things that are very attractive, like love is love. How many of you have heard that? Love is love. Okay? And it's like, are we commanded to love? Yes, right? But we're talking about something much beyond love, right? And so we need to be conscious of influences that come in. This is why Paul told them in 1 Corinthians 5, put that guy out from among you. A little leaven leavens the whole lump. It just takes a little bit to start changing people's thinking. All right, Brandy's going to give it another shot tonight.
I think that a lot of times we forget that a lie is usually wrapped around a small negative truth.
Exactly.
And so for so many people, especially little kids, they start hearing the good things that are in the message, and they can't decipher that from the good, and then they're bombarded even in cartoons at a very early age, unless a parent sits and watches the entire program, they're not aware that, oh, so-and-so has good attitude, or, it's just,
Mm-hmm.
it's that subtle, nudge that they get every single time we are interacting with social media.
Yeah, exactly. Brandy's talking about oftentimes the lie is wrapped in something that's also very true. So it makes it much more palatable and easy for people to agree. Now, one thing I want to say about this is that, and I generally think that Christian parents are pretty good at this, but the world certainly isn't. We cannot leave the education and the moral education and the spiritual education of our children or our grandchildren to the world, to others. That's our primary responsibility. If you choose to send your children to public school, that's fine, right? A lot of your kids have gone to public school. My kids went to public school. I've got 3 faithful kids, right? But the responsibility for their education did not rest upon the teachers. It rested upon me and Shirley, right? And teachers got a little bit upset when I'd go to the parent-teacher conference, and I made sure they knew that, look, you work for me, right? It's my responsibility to educate my kids. And if you ain't doing it right, we're out of here, okay? And then we also have to understand that the spiritual education is greatly helped by the Bible class teachers that we have. The brothers and sisters in the congregation that will devote their time, their energy to teaching our youngsters, right? But we cannot abdicate our responsibility to that. That's first and foremost our responsibility as well, right? They can help, right? But, and even those of you who choose the private school route, okay? Unfortunately, a lot of those private schools are backed by denominational programs and are interested in denominational teaching. So you still have to exercise a tremendous amount of vigilance in what your kids are learning, right? And so we all need to be aware, right? Even as we grow older, of the influence, the subtle influence that the world can have upon us. And God made that very clear to his people. He says, you drive them out, right? You get rid of their altars. You don't talk about their gods. You destroy those. Alan.
Yeah, this verse makes it very clear that if you're around that influence, it's going to happen.
Yeah.
It says they will make you sin, and they will surely be a snare to you. It doesn't say it might happen.
Right.
It's going to happen if you're around it.
Yeah. And it will happen with churches. It will happen with individual Christians, regardless of age. So it's something we've got to be on guard for. This is one of the reasons that we have Bible classes. This is one of the reasons that God forsake the assembling of ourselves together. We have to be aware of that. Ken.
How long ago was there no problem with Timothy and Titus's definition of a deacon? And now there are women deacons in the Church of Christ in at least 2 congregations in California that I know of.
Oh, yeah? Yeah, it is amazing how things start to kind of grow and expand.
Another resource the congregation has are the older folks.
Yeah.
You don't have to be a grandfather, grandmother. Do our young people talk to our elders? What's the secret of being married for 40 or 50 years? You know,
Yeah,
how did you raise the kids to be faithful?
yeah, exactly.
Reach out to our elders.
Yeah. Well, I would certainly hope that all of the, let's say, more mature members of the congregation are conscious of the impact that they can have on the younger members of the congregation, and helping them and what have you, right? You don't necessarily have to be as ancient as Danny, but, if you're older, you could have a lot of wisdom that you can impart as well. All right, let's move on to do not take the name of the Lord in vain. Anybody see anything in this expansion, if you will, of the Ten Commandments that relates to that? I'm looking at chapter 22 at verse 28, where it just flat out says, "You shall not revile God nor curse a ruler of your people." Okay? You shall not revile God nor curse a ruler of your people. What's his issue with cursing a ruler of the people? That's 22:28, by the way. We know, obviously, we shouldn't revile God, but Jenny. Okay, shows no respect for authority, right? Where does authority come from? It comes from God, right? I'm not hearing you, Dan.
It's like we have an election,
Right,
we elected somebody,
right,
and they're the person. In other words, people put it
right.
there. So
Oh, okay. Yeah, the people put them there, but ultimately the authorities that exist are appointed by God, right? And so I'd see when we start cursing our rulers, the rulers of the people, we're actually cursing God's authority, the one that God placed there. I mean, I remember one time, no, I'll get in trouble if I talk about that. All right, let's move on to the third commandment then. All right, the third commandment is remember the Sabbath to keep it holy. All right, and I've got 4 different passages that seem to speak to this. Anybody come up with any? 23:12. All right, so let's take a look at 23:12. Actually, let's take a look at verses 10 through 12. 6 years you shall sow your land and gather in its produce, but the 7th year you shall let it rest and lie fallow, that the poor of your people may eat, and what they leave the beasts of the field may eat. In like manner you shall do with your vineyard and your olive grove. 6 days you shall do your work, and on the 7th day you shall rest, that your ox and your donkey may rest, and the son of your maidservant and the stranger may be refreshed. So we've got the Sabbath for man in this passage, but also there is a Sabbath for agriculture as well. The 7th year, you let the land rest, okay? And so he says, the idea of the 7th and the Sabbath is not just Saturday. A lot of times it's the 7th year, right? Take a look, if you will, over at 21 or verse 2. In chapter 21, verses 1 through 11, God is giving his laws concerning servants or slaves, if you will. And in verse 2, he says, if you buy a Hebrew servant, he shall serve 6 years, and in the 7th, he shall go out free and pay nothing. Okay? So there's that 7th idea as well. And then in 22, verses 29 through 30, wrong chapter. Verses 29 through 30, you shall not delay to offer the first of your ripe produce and your juices. The firstborn of your son shall give to me, you shall give to me. Likewise, you shall do with your oxen and your sheep. It shall be with its mother 7 days. On the 8th day, you shall give it to me. And you shall be holy men to me. You shall not eat any meat which is torn by beasts in the field. You shall throw it to the dogs, right? And so this is just a passage just talking about worship. And basically, that's what the Sabbath is about, okay? And then you have 23 verses 14 through 19. And this is talking about the 3 annual feasts. In verse 14, it says, 3 times you shall keep a feast to me in the year. You shall keep the feast of unleavened bread. You shall eat unleavened bread 7 days, as I commanded you, at the time appointed in the month of Abib, for in it you came out of Egypt. None shall appear before me empty. And the feast of harvest, the first fruits of your labors, which you have sown in the field, and the feast of the ingathering, which is at the end of the year, when you have gathered in the fruit of your labors from the field. 3 times in the year your males shall appear before the Lord God, and you shall not offer the blood of my sacrifice with leavened bread, nor shall the fat of my sacrifice remain till morning. The first of the first fruits of your land you shall bring into the house of the Lord your God, and you shall not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. So again, another passage dealing with worship, and that would follow under remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Now, 2 things here before we move on. This seems like somewhat of an odd command at the end of verse 19. You shall not boil a young goat in its mother's milk. Anybody explain that? What's wrong with that? Who's talking here? Oh.
The commentary says it has to do with the Canaanite ritual.
Okay, there's one possibility that this was a Canaanite ritual, right? You know, boiling a goat in its mother's milk, okay? That's one possibility, and that would have to do with the Canaanite worship and what have you. And that would explain its inclusion in this context. Any other possibilities? There you go, right? God says, don't do it. And really, there's a lot to be said about just that attitude, right? You know, God does not necessarily expect us to understand everything that we're going to read here. One of the things I came across is it's just an affront to nature, right? To sacrifice something, to kill something and cook it in its mother's milk, which was supposed to nurture it and give it health and cause it to have life. It's just like an affront to nature, okay? Later on, we're going to read about you shall not take a bird and its eggs, right? You can't take both when you find them in a nest. And so it's almost as if God's saying, look, there's some things that are just improper, right? Like that's just not right, okay? And it may have something to do with that as well. Context, though, indicates a relationship to a Canaanite ritual or practice. All right, the other thing I want to talk about is those first 11 verses of chapter 21, okay? God starts expounding, if you will, on these 10 commandments. And in verses 1 through 11, what does he start with, and why might that be so? What are verses 1 through 11 dealing with? Slavery, servants, right? Servitude. Why would God start with that? Oh, problem they were having?
Every culture, there's a cheapness to life without God. So God's resetting the table, placing value back on human life, and here's how we're going to do it.
Okay, all right. So God is basically saying, look, if this is going to be practiced, we're going to regulate this practice, right? But also, where had they just come from? They had just come from slavery, right? They had just come from a situation where they were ill-treated, they were oppressed, right? Even though they have fond memories of it, right? How many times do we do that? We have fond memories of a past time because we've forgotten all the difficulties that existed there, all the trauma that existed there. Selective memory. Well, God here is saying, this is how you're going to deal with servitude and servants. And he has, and we're going to see this as we go along through his laws, one law for the Hebrew servant and one law for the stranger who's going to be a servant, right, or a foreigner. Now, is it really slavery in regards to the Hebrew servant? An indentured servitude, right? It's like, here I am, I owe this debt. He may owe it to the person he's going to, submit to. He may owe it to somebody else. That a person steps up and says, I will take care of your debt. You'll serve me for 6 years, and then I'll release you in the 7th year, all right? And so there is that idea. But then I'm telling you, as you're reading chapter 21, don't you read some things in there that just sound absolutely barbaric? It's like God's punishment, the eye for the eye, the tooth for the tooth. It's like, if you kill somebody who's free, all right, you're going to be put to death. If you beat your slave and he dies, well, you're not necessarily going to be put to death, depending on the circumstance. If you strike him so he loses an eye, well, then you got to let him go. It's like, man, I would not want to be an indentured servant to anybody back then at all. Then he talks about you got a Hebrew, and so he's become indentured to you, and he marries one of your handmaid slaves, and he has kids. Well, after 7 years, he can go, but he can't take the handmaid or the kids. They belong to you, right? But what if he wants to stay? Yeah, they would take him. He would give testimony. I want to stay forever, right? And then they put it all through his ear to the door or the doorpost, right? Marking him as now, okay, this guy's part of this household forever, right? Now, typically when we think of slavery, what do we think about? We think about U.S. history. We think about the oppression of people. We think about the forcible enslavement of people. We think about, whippings and lynchings and murders and rapes and all that kind of business, okay? So when we hear the word slave, there's all these negative connotations. But that's not always the case when you're reading about it in the Bible, right? You would have people and they would join themselves to families, right? And they would do this as a means of survival. They would do this as a means of protection. I mean, think about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They had huge households, didn't they? Right? And they had many slaves. And these people ended up joining these households for protection, for benefit, to be part of a larger family, right? So it wasn't what we think about slavery generally, right? Many times these people were treated as part of the household, right? And it was by choice as well. Alan?
Just because God made those rules about beat your slave or lose his eye, you have to let him go. That don't mean he was okay with it. Just like when he talked about divorce.
Right.
And what you need to do. That doesn't mean he was okay with divorce, but
Right.
Here's how you handle it after it happens.
Yeah, Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, you're going to do this thing that God hates. But since you're going to do it, we're going to regulate it, right?
And same thing, he also gave rules and regulations for, when Israel had a king, even though there's not going to be a king here.
Yeah.
And, but the rules are there. So when this happens, this is what the king should not do, or should do, etc.
Yeah.
So these aren't in here that say, yeah, go ahead and get yourself a slave, and go ahead and beat them, or whatever. That's not the point.
Right.
If this happens, then this is how you're supposed to do it.
Yeah. Very good point. And in a way, I want to be very careful not to be misunderstood here. In a way, God is accommodating the cultural practices of the day by saying, you're going to do this, we're going to regulate it, right? You're going to do this, we're going to regulate it, right? But over time, these things change, and you've got the New Testament, which is a whole different ballgame altogether, okay? And so it's God's not saying that slavery's okay necessarily. He is not saying that divorce is okay. In fact, he says he hates divorce. What he's talking about is how you treat people, okay, whether they're slaves or not. All right. Missy.
Is he regulating what society has already set up, or is he setting up rules because they are so different than everybody else?
He is setting up rules to make Israel different, his people, his nation, from the other nations, definitely. And so, again, I don't want to be misunderstood about accommodating society, but here you've got people and they behave in a certain way. So even among my people, we're going to regulate that. But he is definitely setting them up to be different, apart, separate. They're going to be his people. That's a very good point. All right, let's move on to the fourth commandment then. Fourth commandment, honor your father and your mother. Yeah, if you take a look at chapter 21, verses 15 and 17, he who strikes his father or his mother shall surely be put to death. And then verse 17, and he who curses his father or his mother shall surely be put to death. Why? I mean, what if you've just got rotten, no good for nothing, low down, dirty parents? God is Father.
He does not expect to be treated that way.
Right?
So consequently, you should not expect to be treated.
Yeah. And it also has to do with respecting authority and learning to respect authority, right? I had an aunt, and she had some problems. And she lived with my grandmother, her mother, and at times, it looked so much like she was ready just to backhand my grandmother. And that just always made me furious. She'd get that look, and she was much bigger and much stronger than my grandmother. And then, unfortunately, one congregation I worked with for a while had an elder that, before me, completely disrespected his father on a number of occasions. And this guy was an elder. He's no longer serving as an elder. Somebody caught on. But it's just like horrible. That kind of behavior is absolutely repugnant. Okay? And God says, put him to death. Put him to death. That doesn't say anything about the kids swatting the parents swatting the kids, right? My dad was ready to put my lights out one time when I kind of threw a little hissy fit because my mom told me to do something. Like, yikes. I don't want to be in that position anymore. I couldn't get out of the house fast enough, right? Stupid teenager. She had broken her arm. She was a florist. She broke her arm the week of Mother's Day. They had immediately put it in a cast before it had finished swelling, increased pain. After Mother's Day, she's sitting there. She's in a lot of pain. She asked me to do something. Stupid teenager that I was. I could do it, but not without a heavy sigh. Right? Man, I've never seen my dad move so fast in my life. Right? He was ready to kill me. And now, I don't blame him. Right? I didn't blame him at the time, really, but it's like, don't do that. Okay? All right. So honor your father and your mother. Number 5, you shall not kill. What do we got here? What? It didn't say don't kill the kids. No, in fact, there's a lot of times he says to do just that. Kill them kids. In chapter 21, verses 12 through 27, this is all about violence done to others. Okay, whether it's your slave or whether it's a thief breaking into your house, or somebody who is lying in wait to murder someone. So it's thou shalt not kill. That's the catch-all for violence. Okay, and it says you're not going to do violence to one another. And then in 21:29 says, but if the ox tended to the thrust with its horn in times past, and it has been made known to his owner, and he has not kept it confined so that it has killed a man or a woman, the ox shall be stoned, and its owner also shall be put to death. Right? So here you have responsibility for violent animals that you may own. Okay? How many people don't keep their dogs under control? How many times have we heard about dogs getting out and mauling some little child or just anybody, right? And in some cases, killing them, okay? And then everybody raised the hue and cry because the dog's put down. The owner ought to be put down too, right? If their animal killed somebody and they didn't control it, of course, that's according to God's law. And then, of course, 21 through 24. In chapter 22, beginning of verse 21, you shall neither mistreat a stranger nor oppress him, for you are strangers in the land of Egypt. You shall not afflict any widow or fatherless child. If you afflict them in any way, and they cry at all to me, I will surely hear their cry. And my wrath will become hot, and I will kill you with the sword. Your wives shall be widows, and your children fatherless. Right? So, mistreating the vulnerable is something that God's people are not to do either. And that would fall under the general heading of thou shalt not kill. Okay, how about number 6? Well, actually number 7. No, number 6. I think 1 and 2 are combined in the first one. So you shall not commit adultery. Chapter what? Yep. Chapter 22, verses 16 and 17 says, if a man entices a virgin who is not betrothed and lies with her, he shall surely pay the bride price for her to be his wife. If her father utterly refused to give her to him, he shall pay money according to the bride price of virgins. Right? And then if you drop down to verse 19, it says, whoever lies with a beast shall surely be put to death. So you shall not commit adultery, again, is the catch-all for all kinds of sexual sins. Fornication, which is the broadest term, right? Just because it says thou shalt not commit adultery doesn't mean it's all right for a couple of teenagers to get together in the backseat of a car, and have a good time. That's forbidden, right? Then the next one, you shall not steal. See, the thing is we're looking at these, and if you might have gone over this thing. Well, I don't see anything that has to do anything with stealing, except for maybe a robber coming in, right? And if you can kill him if he comes in at night. If it's day, you can't kill him, right? But if it's night, you can kill him. But take a look at chapter 21, verses 28 through 36. This is talking about animal control again. Talks about if an ox gores a man or a woman to death, then the ox shall surely be stoned. We talked about those. In verse 30, if there is imposed on him a sum of money, then he shall pay to redeem his life, whatever is imposed on him. Whether it has gored a son or gored a daughter, according to this judgment, it shall be done to him. If the ox gores a manservant or a maidservant, he shall give to their master 30 shekels of silver, and the ox shall be stoned. If a man opens a pit, or if a man digs a pit and does not cover it, and an ox or a donkey falls in it, the owner of the pit shall make it good. He shall give money to their owner, but the dead beast shall be his. And if one man's ox hurts another so that it dies, then they shall sell the live ox and divide the money from it, and the dead ox they shall also divide. Or if it was known that the ox tended to thrust in time past, and its owner is not kept it confined, he shall surely pay ox for ox, and the dead beast shall be his own. Right? So, I mean, this is talking about property. It's talking about responsibility when it comes to property. Again, agrarian society, you know, and they've got the idea that you've got animals that are going to cause damage to other people's property, and there is restitution and what have you. And you have to pay attention to that, because not to do so is kind of like stealing, right? Also, take a look, if you will, at 22, 1 through 15. He says, if a man steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it or sells it, he shall restore 5 oxen for an ox and 4 sheep for a sheep. If the thief is found breaking in and he is struck so that he dies, there shall be no guilt for his bloodshed. If the sun has risen on him, there shall be guilt for his bloodshed. He should make full restitution. If he has nothing, then he shall be sold for his theft. You know, and it goes on. It talks about, you know, these different things that violate a person's property, right? Or put a person's property at risk. And so God expects his people to respect other people's possessions and other people's property, and to step up and do the right thing if there's any kind of damage. He talks about unintentional damage, right? If you borrow my truck and you damage my truck, there's not much chance of that happening. It's a beater, right? But if you damage my truck, you're responsible for it under Jewish law, right? But if you ask me to help you move, and I take my truck and it's damaged while I'm helping you move, you're not responsible for it, because I had the oversight of the truck, right? And so God expects us to show consideration for other people's property, right? And then, of course, in chapter 22, verses 25 through 27, if you lend money to any of my people who are poor among you, you shall not be like a moneylender to him. You shall not charge him interest. If you ever take your neighbor's garment as a pledge, you shall return it to him before the sun goes down. For that is his only covering. It is his garment for his skin. What will he sleep in? And it will be that when he cries to me, I will hear, for I am gracious. So God says that when you lend to the poor, you're not supposed to charge interest. Not supposed to charge usury. That would be stealing in a sense. It's like, what are these payday advances, these cash places, right? They take advantage of people who are living hand to mouth and can't quite make it to their mouth, right? So they go get an advance on their paycheck, but they have to pay a fee for that, don't they? Right? And a lot of times it's a huge fee. It's an exorbitant fee, right? And God says you don't do that, right? You don't take advantage of people like that. Some people would apply this to the credit industry that just charges incredible interest amounts. And people get tied into that, and they get sucked into that. And then, before you know it, they're using one card to pay off this card, then they're using this card to pay off that card, and they're using that card to pay off that card, right? A lot of foolishness going on there, but people take advantage of that foolishness. And they take advantage of people that end up living their lives that way. In fact, one of the curses that God pronounced upon Israel if they ceased to follow him is they said, I will make you a debtor to other nations. They shall be the head, and you shall be the tail. What's the head do to the tail? It wags it, right? And it's like when you're in debt to someone else, whether it's a big credit card company or an individual, you've got that constantly hanging over your head, right? And how many people in our society are not working for themselves anymore? They're working for their creditors, right? Yeah, it's another form of slavery, right? All right, then we come to you shall not bear false witness. Yeah, 23:1 and 23:1 through 9, actually. You shall not circulate a false report. Do not put your hand with the wicked to be an unrighteous witness. You shall not follow a crowd to do evil. You testify in a dispute so as to turn aside so as to turn aside after many to pervert justice. You shall not show partiality to a poor man in his dispute. If you meet your enemy's ox or his donkey going astray, you shall surely bring it back to him again. If you see the donkey of one who hates you lying under its burden, and you would refrain from helping it, you shall surely help him with it. You shall not pervert the judgment of your poor in his dispute. Keep yourself far from a false matter. Do not kill the innocent and the righteous, for I will not justify the wicked. And you shall take no bribe, for a bribe blinds the discerning and perverts the words of the righteous. Also, you shall not oppress a stranger, for you know the heart of a stranger, because you are strangers in the land of Egypt. So the idea of perverting justice or bearing false witness or being dishonest, okay? And then, you shall not covet. Who came up with anything for you shall not covet? 22 verses 25 through what? Yeah. Okay, there's the lending money. See, there's a lot of things that would fall under the category of you shall not covet. Lending money at exorbitant interest rates, lending to the poor at interest rates, period, right? Stealing, right? Taking something from somebody, not helping somebody. There's a lot of things that would fall under the idea of you shall not covet. And then, of course, all the laws concerning property, that you read about in 22 verses 1 through 15. So God elaborates in these chapters upon the Ten Commandments. Next week, we'll take a look at chapter 24 because there's some fascinating stuff in there where Moses, Aaron, Hur, and the 70 elders see God, right? And we'll talk about that a little bit next week. All right, I appreciate your comments and your participation this evening.
Good we can all be out tonight. Craig mentioned visitors, and we do have several. So welcome to y'all, and you're always welcome here at O-Wire. Didn't have anybody mention to me as being sick. Anybody know of anybody we need to mention? Okay. And of course, those that are out of town, let's remember those folks. The Griffins, Wes is at guard drill, and Austin and Sarah are still in Oregon. And Sharon reports that the situation with Sarah's parents and the wildfire, nothing has changed, but they stand ready to evacuate if they're ordered to do so. Again, classes resume Sunday at 9 o'clock. Tommy in the auditorium with Colossians. Craig will be upstairs with the high school and college. And this includes Wednesday night classes next week also. The elders really appreciate all the work that you teachers put into your classes, so thank y'all for that. Folks, the elders need your help with the matter. And I'll just read a brief statement. It has come to the attention of the elders that Sister Colette Pavovar has entered into a living arrangement that the elders feel is not healthy for her spiritually. She has been contacted by the eldership, and the elders expressed their concern to her, as well as offering an alternative solution that would cost her nothing. Before the elders pursue this matter further, the elders are asking that you reach out to Colette and encourage her to consider her current situation. Anything else we need to announce? Okay, who has a closing prayer? Okay, Tommy.
Pray with me. Lord, thank you for this family and for the care that we have for one another. Father, we ask your guidance in helping us to reach out to Colette and to show her that we love her. Help us, please, Father, to be true brothers and sisters to one another, to understand our family is how you want us to view one another. And as we understand those responsibilities, help us to be committed to serving one another and therefore pleasing you and glorifying you. Help us, please, to understand that we are to be a peculiar people to this world. Help us to put aside the enticements of culture that confront us. Help us to be pure and holy. Forgive us when we fall short of that. In Jesus' name, amen.